So how you? I mean, we're a few days on from Cardiff the other evening.
Yeah.
You were there with Nathan. Your overriding sense was one of great disappointment. It's quite interesting to look at the Sunday papers here this afternoon. Various different former players writing their pieces in different papers. I certainly got the sense from Paul McGrath and from Kevin Moran that they're worried there might be something slightly amiss or broken in the Irish camp now. They got the sense for the first time really that this was a group of players. They didn't want to use the word not trying, but that sentence was in there in a sense, or that there was something kind of missing, and they just wonder if something's gone a little bit rotten.
Well, listen, I find that incredible that any former player, knowing what it means to put on the shirt, the lucky few as such, would ever question lads' commitment and say they're not trying. At no stage throughout that commentary with Nathan, as bad as we were, at no stage did I believe that any of those players were down in tools or such, or weren't given everything that they hoped to give. But certainly there is a dark cloud over the Irish team at the moment for a host of reasons. It's disjointed, there's disharmony as such. And it's a concern. Of course it is. Listen, you can't take away the fact that we had 5 of our first team starters not playing. And if you did that to the Wales team, they would struggle. So I would never get away from that. The biggest concern of mine, and has been throughout Martin O'Neill's tenure, to be perfectly honest, is the lack of coaching, the lack of organisation. Because Ryan Giggs is only 4 games into his tenure, and he put on a show which was so obvious, so clear, that they'd worked tirelessly on that training field to work out how to create overloads all over the pitch. Their attacking fluidity going forward. But more impressive was how good they were without the ball. And notably the likes of world superstars like Gareth Bale, top Premier League players like Joe Allen, Ramsey, knowing that they had a massive role to play in terms of protecting their goal. And that's the big difference. That was the big difference I took from that particular game that night.
So what are some of the small things that you're talking about or seeing there when you're talking about what they're doing without the ball, or what they're doing with the ball that you're not seeing from Ireland?
Well, listen, first of all, I'll say how well Wales played. Yeah. And I was surprised at how quickly, because this isn't, I know he's inherited a good group, Ryan Giggs, but he's changed the formation completely from Chris Coleman. They play in a totally different style. He's moved away from that back 5 that served them so well in the Euros, getting to the semi-finals. And then suddenly to do that in that short space of time, where we keep saying, and we know as ex-players, we know as coaches, that you have very little time with international players, but he's got his message across so quickly. And it just was the way, in fact, that a 17-year-old can dominate a game. And it's not because of he's such a brilliant player. He played his role perfectly, but you could tell exactly what was expected of him. Each moment throughout that pitch, wherever they played, all those players know exactly where they were supposed to be. And they learnt lessons, certainly from when they played us last qualifying campaign, home and away, in that when we try to block it up and defend deep, don't try and go through the middle of us. Look for quick switches of play, and they did that. They played through the thirds, and if Ireland narrowed up and got men behind the ball, the quick switches of play suddenly had us stretched, and suddenly then you've got our defenders having to defend space. They're not particularly good at it, unfortunately.
And what were we doing by comparison then?
Hanging in there. Literally hanging in there. Even the fact that we had those 2 men in central midfield, we said it in commentary, that Callum Robinson didn't understand his role as a second striker in possession. Out of possession, he didn't understand he had to drop in and beef up our midfield to make 3 in there. Aaron Ramsey done it perfectly for Wales, and as a result, our 2, as much as we talked about Ampadu and Joe Allen dominating, couldn't lay a glove on them, couldn't even get near them, because as soon as they went to go out and play, they just played through the thirds, expose us. And there was lots of trigger points. The right side of midfield, Brooks, the left side, Lawrence, would come inside, offer options in between the lines. We couldn't cope with that. And if we didn't narrow it up, then their fullbacks would come up in advanced areas to create the width. If their wide men for Wales went wide, invariably their fullbacks then went into to overload the midfield. Now that's a tactic you normally associate with Pep Guardiola's teams.
Right.
You know, that fullback's coming into centre midfield and beefing that area up. And you could just see it wasn't off the cuff. It was well drilled. And as someone who's a student of football and would admire it, I was really impressed with it. I know people have talked about Ryan Giggs. He's not the most inspiring in terms of his team talks, because we've seen those little clips of him on television. But certainly, I tell you what, he's a good coach if he can make his team play that well that quickly. Yeah,
that sounds very impressive, actually, because even Giggs was bemoaning the lack of time. But look, the guy knows football. He's been around a long time. He knows tactics. Yeah, well, listen, and he's got his message across.
Joe, you say he knows football. He's not as experienced as Martin O'Neill. He's not as experienced as Roy Keane.
Yeah.
So listen, we're talking about guys who Martin O'Neill's been so successful as a manager. and we talked about his strengths as a manager. And I often talk to players who have played
sorry, Gary,
with
him.
I
finished that point, but I was going to say, do we know if Martin O'Neill's successful in football with the brand of what what you're talking about with regards to what Giggs is bringing? Like, was that ever O'Neill? Was O'Neill ever successful with that method, or was it more about up and at 'em and we're motivated and we're in their faces, as opposed to a slightly more cultured approach?
Well, listen, I'm not a football purist or a snob. I like successful teams, winning teams, and I'd argue that his Leicester team, his Villa team, his Celtic team were exactly that. But if you're asking me what is Martin O'Neill's strength in terms of talking to people who've played with him, and I've said this, I've been quite consistent even before he got the job.
Yeah.
One was his motivation. Well, I would just counter that by saying you don't need to motivate players to play for Ireland. That's a give me. If you need motivating to put on that jersey, then you're playing the wrong game. You're in the wrong team. And the second thing, and I think this is underestimated, recruitment. Brilliant at recruiting players we'd never heard of at Leicester, bringing them through. Neil Lennon, Muzzy Izzet, these type of guys from the lower leagues, spotting these type of players, Robbie Savage, all these. And it happened again at Celtic in terms of recruitment. Top players in terms of problem solvers. And then again at Villa, people who knew how to do their jobs. And that probably gives you an indication that he had players who could solve problems themselves on the pitch and didn't necessarily need their hand held. It's a different remit now in terms of football. I think so many of these young players coming, even at Premier League, Championship levels now, are coached to within an inch of their life. They know exactly where they're supposed to be, so there's no excuses. I don't think that's Martin O'Neill's style.
Yeah. Like you mentioned there, Callum Robinson playing off Walters, and we're looking at a 17-year-old bossing the game. And, that's a 5-minute chat, surely. When we don't have the ball, drop in and make it difficult for whoever is trying to orchestrate things in midfield, drop back in and help out Horan and help out Hendrick and make it a 3 in midfield. Surely that is literally all that needs to be said there, and surely that was said. Surely that was said to him.
Oh, yeah, listen, I've no doubt in it. And I actually witnessed Roy Keane continually telling him, drop in. Okay. I could see it from the bench. So the message was coming across. But ultimately, then I'd argue because I've coached a little bit in the lower leagues, and it's difficult. Some players can't take information on. And you've got to make a decision that no matter how many times you tell them, in the heat of the battle, they just cannot see it for themselves quick enough. So you have to give that information coming from the sides, and Roy did that. But I would argue then that if you have to remind them from the sides, you have not got your message across on the training field. Simple as that.
Okay.
That's the issue.
Yeah, and that is a continued concern that we all have. Take the back four then. So all four are Premier League players. We're talking 150 international caps between them. And they were made look extremely ordinary. And we've seen them, we've seen Duffy and Brighton have been involved in very good performances defensively already this season. Clark, you can imagine what Rafa Benitez is doing with Clark. Probably to the point of absolute boredom. We've got Dyche with Ward, again, seems to be very detail-orientated. Seamus Coleman can certainly take instruction, that's for sure, and he's very experienced at this stage. And yet, in your assessment of how they seem to look as a four?
Well, listen, that four served us well throughout the last couple of campaigns with Martin O'Neill. They've been impressive, backs to wall defending, but in my opinion, the reality is more often than not, we've got a deep lying 5-man midfield. I don't think it's a particularly organised one, but we've got bodies. Yeah. It's difficult to play through them. And as a result, then they've got less space to defend. Yeah. If you think about that back four, or even Duffy, the likes of Clark, Ward, whatever, if you think about them, certainly in that second half when we're chasing the game against Denmark, the game opens up. There's space now and they're a little bit exposed. And they're not then as comfortable as they would be in a rigid back four. Now, Sean Dyche will do something similar with his midfield. They'll protect their back four. They're well disciplined. They're well drilled. So Stephen Ward knows exactly where he's supposed to be. Likewise, Chris Hughton. We know Rafa Benitez does it all the time. You talk about boredom, Joe. What's boring about having a good defence? Wow. It's as if people think you can just turn on the pitch and you can be well drilled. Make no mistake, as exciting and as brilliant as Pep Guardiola's teams are, that defence will be well drilled, that they know exactly where they're supposed to be at any stage, wherever that ball is. And that's the biggest. This is the biggest disappointment, is that we've seen so many. Say, for example, the highlights of Martin O'Neill's tenure: the Germany win, the Italy win, the Wales win. It's back to the wall defending. It's not disciplined, quality defending, squeezed in the line, catching people offside. It's just defending in sheer numbers. And then suddenly against Wales, where as I said, that they learnt their lesson. They didn't play through the middle. And what they didn't do, which was more noticeable than anything, they never let our back four get set. As soon as Wayne Hennessy won that ball, he threw it. As soon as that ball went out for throw-ins, they threw it into play again. So they've recognised, listen, this Irish team's tough to beat. If you let them get set, get organised and get into nice, good early positions, allow their midfield to then come back and protect them, they're very difficult to break down. But if you go at them early and create space and ask them to defend in space and make quick decisions, they're not as impressive.
The worrying thing is they seem to cause us trouble, whether they went early, as you say, or if they had slow build-up. You know, either way, they seem to be causing us issues. It's not like anything worked necessarily. You couldn't say we ever looked totally comfortable or you ever felt like a passage of play couldn't potentially end badly for us. And so, I mean, look, I think we all have big concerns over what O'Neill's doing or not doing, and they're ongoing. I did have some sympathy for him on Thursday night when you looked at who he was missing. You know, there is a point that this was just a very, very bad night at the office, and you could list off the 2 or 3 or 4 players who'd come back in and really change the complexion of what that side can do. And it's just a very bad night at a very unfortunate time for O'Neill, and there is probably a danger we could all overreact here. And people, you know, the question is now being posed in various places, is it time to get rid of the manager before the next qualification campaign proper kicks off? And I mean, it's unfair to base that on what we've just seen on Thursday night, I would suggest.
Well, I totally agree with you. I don't think it's going to be based on that evening. I think it's a culmination of performances as such, because, and I've said this before, some of our results have been so impressive. Yeah, they've been brilliant results. You can say, like, I wish we could play better. And even if you played brilliantly and were expansive football, you'd be hard pressed to get some of the results that Martin O'Neill's achieved. Yeah. But within that, in terms of the quality of our play, the ball retention, the fact that Georgia dominated us home and away on a ball shouldn't really happen. So as long as you're winning games, you can bat it off. As soon as you start losing games, then people are going to start dissecting what you're actually doing. And I think that's what's happened. I think the supporters now are looking at our dream team and they're probably saying, OK, what exactly are you doing with these players? Because this argument's going to rage on between the supporters. It's raging on between ex-players. I saw and listened to Kev Kilban's brilliant interviews with Ronnie Whelan and Mark Lawrenson. And Mark Lawrenson and Ronnie Whelan, 2 iconic players, not only for Ireland, but of that great 80s Liverpool team. And they were on 2 complete ends of the spectrum. Mark Lawrenson saying that there's a ceiling for these players in that how can we expect them to play better than they actually perform week in, week out? Yeah. Whereas Ronnie Whelan was the opposite and saying, well, no, hold on a minute. We're talking about if you coach these players, lesser teams can be successful, the likes of Iceland and that scenario. And what really pricked my thought process there when Ronnie said that is that I thought about that brilliant 80s team that he played for Liverpool, the type of team that passed teams off the park, passed them to death. You couldn't get the ball for them. Then suddenly he comes away from that to join up with Jack Charlton's Ireland, Route 1, attritional style football, and is successful at both. Yeah. And if you listen to him now, that all came down because he says that under Jack, everyone knew exactly what their role was. We may well have been playing against players who were better than us. Now, listen, this is our pioneer Irish team, probably our best ever. Yeah. And we had some fantastic players, but nevertheless, they're up against teams with better players, supposedly, but they were able to lay a glove on them. And I would say, that, and I'd argue this case, that all of Ireland's successful football teams have had to bridge that gap in quality, but have managed to do that because they're hard to beat and they're organised. Yeah,
there are some real contradictions, aren't there? I mean, you mentioned the brilliant results, and you know, O'Neill will rightly, you know, so O'Neill will say, well, if you're giving out to you all have issues with my approach, and then didn't it work for some of the bigger results? Like there have been managers who've come and gone with Ireland and never managed to get the big results. Like O'Neill, for all the failings, has been capable of getting the big result where we do overperform, we do something fairly remarkable, and like that is a gift. There are lots of managers who'd be like would love to be able to overachieve here and there. And so there's that, and then on the flip side, what's exacerbating maybe the sense of doom and gloom is the sense that things aren't right within the camp. The Harry Arter situation rumbles on. You wonder, you know, Declan Rice, you hope something hasn't suddenly, you know, they've had to quash the suggestion that maybe Rice saw or was around the Harry Arter disagreement, and maybe that's part of his thinking. Maybe it's not. O'Neill has insisted it's completely unconnected. But the point is, there is a sense that this is not a happy camp. And that has generally not been the sense with Irish teams going back to your day and beyond. It's always been a happy place where players, regardless of their club situation, want to go to. They'll play through injuries to play for Ireland. And there is now a worry over just how happy a place it is. And so that is part of the discussion now. And that's an extra layer that we have to try and figure out.
Yeah, listen, there's so many contradictions, as you quite rightly said, and ultimately, it's a happy place if you're winning games. Of course it is, and I think the timing of the whole media storm and regarding Declan and Harry Arter is probably come at a worse time for him on the back of the drubbing against Denmark, and then it puts huge pressure on him against a Wales team who look like they're on the verge of a new era. They're a vibrant young team, and we had so many players missing. Of course, that's going to add to the pressures. But I do agree with you. I think ultimately this dark cloud over the Irish team, and Martin O'Neill talked about a new era. That's the frustrating thing. We've seen nothing that's changed coaching-wise. You can't visually look at that team and say they're well drilled. I think Declan Rice coming on the scene was a silver lining. Of course it was. It was something for us all to look forward to. And then suddenly when that's pulled away from us, then the doom and gloom kicks in again. But it's a difficult time. You're right. I think the double-header next month will be massive. We'll have players back and you look for a response. I said this before, I've no doubt that our players will come out fighting. I just don't know whether or not they'll come out organised.
Yeah. The wider picture, of course, is that we're not getting the players through as well, and that's a big worry. And the FAI are going to have to contend with those questions, and they are big questions. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I'm sure I don't know, did you watch any of England and Spain last night? And England have managed to turn themselves, as we've seen, into a technical side. I mean, how successful they'll be, or otherwise they keep the ball and they play. They've changed how they play football, or certainly the type of players that they're bringing through. And you see a very technical Wales side, and you just wonder if we missed the boat here. Like, are we just left it to Premier League clubs, and that model has worked for a long time to bring our players through. But like, the game has changed over there, and Premier League clubs are going far and wide for players, and they're not going to bring as many Irish players through. And we really should have to take responsibility for it in a way that maybe we thought we could get away without doing. But that's been the case for a long time now. And someone made the point earlier here in the show that I guess the 13-year-old or the 10-year-old who was knocking around in parks in Dublin when John Delaney first became CEO is now 23. Like a good chunk of time has passed, and we've never felt further away. It's never felt like the Irish manager has less to work with.
Listen, this is a massive debate in terms of what Declan's just opened up, a massive review of what's happening. I think a lot of the press in England are kind of accusing Ireland now of like going hunting was the word they're using, for 13-year-olds and trying to snare them that way to declare for Ireland. And I know we've had that big debate, Joe, in terms of you don't know what you are as a young player, and it's opened my mind a little bit, to be perfectly honest. It really has, in terms of dual heritage and stuff like that young players can't. But you talked about England trying to go down this technical path. Well, they're ultimately, although they're semi-finalists in the World Cup, they're struggling. They can't beat any of the big teams. They're going up against the technically gifted teams. They've lost twice to Belgium, lost to Croatia. So they've realised that they can beat a certain amount, and invariably it got them to the semi-finals of the World Cup. But they're looking forward. They're trying to create something so they can really break through that ceiling that seems to stop in them. And I think a lot of people, and certainly English supporters, are thinking, well, why are England looking for someone like Declan Rice? Well, an 18-year-old, as if we ain't got... The fact of the matter is, they don't have young players who can play that position as well as he can coming through. Gareth Southgate has even admitted we're going to have to start looking, this is what he said, we are going to have to start looking in the Championship for England internationals. I mean, that's an incredible statement.
Yeah, no, it's a big change. But I do feel like they're going in the right direction, and they've had underage success at World Cups, whereas what is there for us? Like, what would you, if you were the optimist here in this conversation, looking to the next 5 years?
Well, I look at, in terms of how gifted our young players are at sport. There's no doubt about it. Whether it's the GA, hurling, whatever, soccer, whatever. We are a gifted nation, sporting nation. There's no doubt about it. And why then are they not coming through? There has to be a root and branch review of it, because if you're looking at the scenario and saying, okay, what's the end game? Why are we not getting it? It's too late by then. You have to go right back to the beginning. And Delaney, quite rightly now, and his infrastructure that he's put in place, will ask questions. I mean, I talked about it a couple of seasons ago, this PR stunt, bringing the likes of Keith Andrews in and Kenny Cunningham, McPhail, Duff, and trying to bring something. But, them guys, I mean, Kenny, Keith Andrews, they didn't last particularly long there. They didn't really necessarily tap into their qualities as coaches, which I've seen them both coach. They're very good. And it's not a case of them making the decision to go towards the media side of things. I think they both wanted to do coaching, but they weren't able to progress. Whether or not the coaches at the time didn't feel comfortable having them there. And now, listen, I would argue as well, just because you play for the national team doesn't necessarily mean you know how to coach. that's a totally different remit. I said the scenario about Robbie Keane trying to bring him in. Well, listen, do it, but can he coach? I know he's an iconic player. He's a brilliant player, but can he actually coach? That's the big question you've got to ask. And I think there's a lot of questions to be asked, because I don't understand why we're so gifted. And I know the world has changed, society has changed in terms of not everyone's out kicking ball now. They might be at home on computers and stuff like that. And Gordon Strachan done a really good piece about the fact that Scotland are not producing players like they did in the 70s and 80s. And he allied it to the fact that there's just not the numbers who are actually playing football anymore at any age group. So why then would we expect them to come through? But it is a big question. It's a big concern. And I just think that it just looks like we're in a bad stage of our cycle right now.
No, it feels like a low point. Like, to sum up, that's our worst start. If you call this a campaign, and I'm going to, because this was a competitive game, and this is a real route through to a qualification.
Absolutely.
This is our worst start since the 1962 World Cup campaign, when we lost 4-1 as well, incidentally, to Scotland. So it's a real low point. This was a serious game. You would suggest that the players coming through, again, it's a low point. We're paying the management team in excess of close to 3 million. Ryan Giggs getting 400 grand for his job. Martin O'Neill's close to 2 million. Roy is another amount on top of that. So, is the next management, what's the next manager going to come in and expect? If you did want to, make a change, that's going to cost a lot of money. And yet we're still talking about a lesser group of players than we've had in quite some time, potentially. And we're not drilled. We don't look organised. And then there's the Harry Arter thing. There's that atmosphere rumbling in the background, and that worry that Roy is getting into scuffles with players. And you throw it all together, and it feels like a particularly a low point here. I mean, us fighting our way out of this, if we're not a well-drilled side and we don't have great talent coming through, in the short term, I'm not sure how we do. Like, we get James McLean back and hope he puts in a few big tackles and the crowd roar, and we try and muscle a win here and there. Like, Denmark and Wales are above that now, no?
Joe, all our good performances under Martin have been about muscling a win.
Sure.
Don't tell me about any game that we dominated from start to finish. The away win in Austria was impressive. Of course it was, bearing in mind the record that Austria had in the previous campaign, but they were a shadow of the team throughout the rest of that campaign.
No,
so
the one bright spot might be at the Euros. At the Euros, there was football breaking out, and there was a sense that Brady and Hendrick in midfield, we'd found something. There was a sense in Euro 2016 we were moving, and now there's no sense.
No, I agree with you. I think that the excitement coming out of Euro 16 was the fact that Brady, Hendricks, Arter, and McCarthy suggested we had a really athletic, quality Premier League midfield. Now, that has not materialised for a host of reasons, really. There's been a lot of injuries, but certainly even Jeff Hendricks, you're just feeling like, come on, we know you're a top player, but the game seems to pass him by. Brady's had his injuries, McCarthy the same, Arter's now having a sabbatical as such. So all those positive notes coming out of that tournament where, to be perfectly honest, we got battered against Belgium. We played against Italy's second string. And I'm not taking it away in terms of how good that win was, because that's an iconic moment, Brady's goal. It really was. It will live on in the memory. But you need a bit of clarity there. That's not Italy's first team as such. Yeah. But all that excitement, then, of course, the drubbing against Denmark, and we're thinking, all right, a new era, come on, produce it, then show us something. Declan Rice, and then it doesn't materialise. The only thing I will say, and this frustrates me a little bit about Martin O'Neill, is that he's now continually saying about he doesn't have the players. He keeps saying that I don't have a goal scorer like Robbie Keane. Well, Ireland have never had a goal scorer like Robbie Keane. That's not the norm. He's a one-off. Noel Quinn's something like 20 goals in 80, 90 games. Aldo the same. Frank Stapleton, Cass. So we've never had an out-and-out goal scorer as such.
Sure, but there were better options than what we have now, in fairness to him.
But when he talks a little bit like that, he's starting to go into the little bit of rhetoric that Trapattoni was talking about in terms of belittling what we are capable of. And when they were initially appointed the Dream Team, I keep referencing that, it's not my description of them as such, but what they were titled with, I like the fact that they would know exactly how the Irish footballer thinks, his mindset, that when he pulls that shirt on, he doesn't care. He's never going to take a backward step. He's never going to take a knee for anyone. Don't start telling us we're not very good. Tell us how good we can possibly be and coach us to be that.
Yeah. Interesting few days coming up. There's the Poland friendly, and then next month, I mean, things could get ugly next month, I suppose, couldn't it?
Well, Joe, listen,
as a final thought.
I watched Poland against Italy. They were really impressive. I know they were shocking. They underachieved at the World Cup, but they put this new era that Mancini's trying to put together with Italy. They dominated them. And you're right, next month against a Denmark team and a Welsh team, I would say we've got it all to do.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure we'll talk to you in the meantime. Thanks a million. Much appreciated.
Cheers, Joe. Good luck.
Cheers. Gary Breen there.